All right, let's start by getting this out of the way. We're not sponsored by Festool.
Or Domino's for that matter.
Right, though in full transparency, they did send me this impact driver like a year ago.
And also, Domino's sent me this slice.
Trade?
Anyway, a question we get asked a lot is, should I buy a domino?
Yeah, and it seems like it usually comes from somebody who's kind of already made up their mind, but they're just looking to future-proof against buyer's remorse or something.
Right, so if you're thinking about purchasing a domino and can afford one, I don't think it's a purchase that anyone would quickly or maybe even ever regret.
That said, what we're gonna do in this video is go over the most common use cases that we have for ours, show alternative methods for achieving those same things, and kind of just try to illustrate where the domino shines and where it doesn't so that you can make that decision for yourself. All right, let's get into it. So this seemed like a good place to start because if I had to guess, this is probably the most common task that people use their dominoes for. And even though I can't be certain of that, what I am fairly certain of is this is where the most dominoes get used, like as in the actual little tenons. And that is gluing up or assembling panels, be it tabletops, panels for cabinets, whatever. Now, one of the most common misconceptions when it comes to using dominoes, dowels, biscuits, beadlock tenons, etc., in a panel glue up is that we're doing it for the added strength. And honestly, I don't even know if it adds or subtracts strength, but what I do know is that for me at least, that's irrelevant. Because even with just glue, an edge-to-edge joint like this is already gonna be incredibly strong. Like strong enough that you can often glue two boards together, let them fully cure, and hit them with a hammer, and when it eventually splits, it's gonna be at the wood and not at the seam. Meaning the glue bond is actually stronger than the wood in a lot of cases. So then if it's not for strength, you might be wondering, well, then what's the point of using dominoes or dowels or whatever in a panel glue up? And the answer is coplanarness, or coplanarity. Keeping things coplanar, meaning that the faces of the boards across the panel match in height. Now, in a perfect world, this wouldn't be a concern because all of your boards would be dead flat regardless of their length, but that's just not reality. And dominoes, beadlock tenons, and dowels can all do a really good job of forcing things into alignment. When it comes to biscuits, I'm sure that they help as well, but I'll be 100% honest, I've never used a biscuit, so I can't really speak to that.
Liar. I thought you said you don't use biscuits.
I'm not using it, I'm eating it. See?
Okay.
Okay, so while the other three are all equally suitable for this, the reason that I tend to go with a domino, actually there's two reasons, and the first is speed. Cutting dominoes is just quicker. And the second, which I guess kind of ties into speed, is that I can cut them paying a little less attention to accuracy by cutting the mortise in one side of the joint slightly wider than the other side. So if I'm doing, say, 12 of them across a 60-inch long joint, I don't have to worry about perfect alignment. So when it comes to the question of, do I need a domino to do any of this? The answer is no. There's plenty of ways that you can make sure that you get a good panel glue up. Like I already said, you can use dowels or beadlock tenons or biscuits as an alternative. And you could also use nothing, and then some clamps and or cauls to hold things flat while they glue up. Actually, I remember woodpeckers made this one-time tool called a Clampzilla that I really wanted to try, but I just never got my hands on it. Anyway, the point is, no, you don't need a domino for this. But yes, it is nice, and it is the method that I seem to gravitate to more often than not.
A natural progression after having made panels is to then use those panels for something else. And a very common use for panels that aren't remaining panels is to cut them up and use them to make boxes or really casework of any kind. And of course, there are many methods for putting together boxes or casework, so I'm going to talk about where and when I like to use the domino, and where the domino shines and maybe doesn't shine in this context. Obviously, there are a ton of different ways to make a box, and many of those methods don't make sense to compare to a domino, like dovetails for example, so we're just going to leave those out of this. For simplicity, I'm going to talk about joints that make sense to do with a domino and the other methods that easily compare. So let's start with the most simple example, a standard butt joint. This joint is most often an end grain to face grain connection, and just as is, this is about as weak as joints get, so we obviously need to reinforce something like this, and obviously there are many ways to do this. We could use screws with or without plugs, dowels, biscuits, pocket screws, you get the point. But how does the domino stack up? Well, let's first ask, do we want any joinery to show? If not, that eliminates pocket holes, screws and plugs, stuff like that. So we basically have dominoes, biscuits, dowels, and in my mind, the choice comes down to speed and accuracy, and the domino really takes the cake for both of those in a situation like this. Biscuits and dowels can be both accurate and fairly quick, but honestly, the domino has the edge. The one caveat that I'll say in a situation like this is that the context of the joint might actually end up dictating the technique. I have to think if I'm using a butt joint for something, I'm either not super concerned about the joinery method, so pocket holes or screws would be just fine, or I even want to add a little detail, so maybe screws with a contrasting plug might be nice. So when thinking about it in a slightly roundabout way, the domino actually might not be the best tool for this situation. Which brings me to the next example, which is a miter joint. Using a similar mindset, for the most part in my furniture, when I'm using a miter joint, I'm going for a clean look. So if reinforcing the joint is critical, I often don't want to add anything to it. Things like screws and plugs are out. So we're back to choosing based on speed and accuracy, and I'll be honest, miter joints might be where the domino shines the most. I can quickly and with near perfect accuracy lay out and cut the mortises that will allow for a super clean joint with no visible joinery, as well as give me more than enough alignment so that gluing up the joint is no sweat. I think the takeaway here, and will probably sound like a broken record by the end of this video, is that the domino certainly isn't the only way to get these things done. And honestly, the advantages might be pretty marginal, but if you find yourself in a situation where speed and accuracy are critical, you might find yourself leaning on the domino more than anything else.
All right, so in the first two examples, it seemed like the running theme was sort of that the domino's the fast, easy approach. And I think that that's kind of the way that people think of the domino in general, like it's woodworking on easy mode or something like that. But this example is going to throw that theory on its head because it actually makes things more difficult. So it's hard to classify exactly what this process is, and I'm going to talk about it with respect to some of the recent chairs that we made for our plans. And by the way, if you want to check those out, we'll have a link in the description, as well as a link to a preview chapter that you can watch here on YouTube that'll give you a better idea of what our plans are like. So check those out if you're interested. But anyway, getting back to this video, it's basically anytime that you're trying to join a panel, like say a seat or a backrest, to another structure of some sort, like for example, a chair leg. So let's cover the options from hardest to easiest, which will be the domino, more of a traditional floating tenon, and then finally screws. All right, so we're gonna use the example of wanting to attach this seat panel to this chair side assembly. And at first glance, it might seem really easy. Just reference the top face of the seat and the top edge of the chair side assembly, cut in a bunch of dominoes or dowels, and you're good to go. And while you could do that for the front half, as you approach the rear, that's going to become impossible due to this portion of the chair that leads up to the backrest, which is going to get in the way. So basically, you could cut the mortises in the front half this way, but in the back, you'd have to do it this way. So rather than cutting dominoes two different ways, I think it's better to be consistent and just do all of them this way. So what you would have to do is clamp your seat panel to your side assembly, wherever you want it, and then mark on the top of both the panel and the side assembly where you want to place your dominoes or dowels. Then you'd take it all apart and transfer all of those marks down the inside face of the chair side assembly, and then we can set up a guide to help us cut all of the mortises. And this is where a bunch of math gets involved, and the reason that it can get confusing is because we're cutting the mortises in the panel this way, where the domino's fence is the reference point, and the mortises in the side assembly this way, where the domino's base plate is the reference point. So long story short, you're adding in multiple setups and multiple measurements and basically just more opportunity for human error. But in any case, once you determine everything, then we'd still have to transfer our marks up the straight edge guide and around the corner onto its face. So with everything marked out, now we can cut all of our mortises on the chair panel the normal way, and then cut them onto the side assembly by flipping up the fence on the domino and referencing the straight edge that we just clamped on a couple seconds ago. Now, all of this might sound convoluted, but this is literally the easiest example of this. And as you start working with panels that don't even follow a reference edge, like for example, if the seat panel were to slightly angle away from the side assembly, it just introduces more and more referential math and gets harder to do. But thankfully, there's a really easy way to handle these kinds of joints with just screws that'll still give you a really clean result. But let's just say that for whatever reason, you're absolutely against metal fasteners and you want to use them only when absolutely necessary. A slightly easier method than the domino approach is going to be one big floating tenon. Well, I guess it'd be two technically, but anyway, for this method, we're going to cut all of the joinery in with a router. And we're going to use either a spiral bit or a flat bottom bit. And again, there's going to be a little bit of math, but this time it's a lot easier. So the only two things that you'd need to know are where you want the center of the mortise on the panel to be, and the distance from your router's base plate to the center of the bit. Then I'll just place a straight edge guide at that distance from my reference edge, which was the top edge of the chair side assembly, and use that to cut in my mortise. Then to cut the mortise in the seat panel, we'll use the router table and the same bit so that we know that they're identical in width. Then finally, to make the tenon, you can use an offcut from whatever hardwood you've got laying around, and you'll want to use either a table saw or in this case a planer to make it match the width of your mortises. And then you can assemble everything. Okay, finally, the really easy way to do this with just screws. So here let's change the example to attaching the stretchers and the backrest, because it's essentially the same process, except that it would be harder because they aren't necessarily angled to match any reference edge. And one of the great things about this method is that attaching things at an arbitrary angle is just as easy as attaching them to some kind of known angle. So the way that I would go about this is I would do a dry assembly to position all of my panels and stretchers wherever I like the look and function of them, and you can just keep adjusting until you're happy. Then with everything clamped up, I'm going to drill in some pilot holes that are going to go through the side assembly and into the panels. From there we can unclamp, and on the outside faces of the chair side assembly, we'll use a Forstner bit to countersink where the screw head will be by about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch. Then you literally just screw and glue everything together. So while that's drying up, we'll use a plug cutter to cut some plugs out of one of the offcut pieces of wood that we're using. That way we can get the best match possible. That said, if you don't have a plug cutter, you could just buy some dowel of either a matching species or a contrasting species, if you like that look. Finally, we'll glue and tap the plugs into place, cut them down, and after you've got everything sanded and finished, it's gonna be pretty inconspicuous. So to answer those questions yet again, can you use a domino for this kind of joint? Yes. Do you need a domino for this kind of joint? Definitely not. And is the domino the best or easiest approach? Well, best, I guess that's subjective. And easiest? Heck no. But you know it is easy. Sean?
Two things actually. One is snuggling this cute puppy, and the other is making a website with Squarespace. Both Chris and I have been using Squarespace for years now to build our websites, and honestly, it's one of the best things we did when starting our businesses. At the time, I had no idea what I needed to do to build a website, but Squarespace makes it super easy to get up and running with plenty of professional looking templates to choose from, as well as making things like purchasing domains really simple. Squarespace also has plenty of e-commerce tools to help you grow your business, things like inventory management, a simple and secure checkout process, and unlimited products allow us to easily manage online transactions and not get bogged down with mundane tasks so that we can devote more time to doing the things we enjoy, like cutting domino mortises or snuggling this cute puppy. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you already have one, go check out Squarespace to see if it might be a better option for you. Head over to squarespace.com/4eyes for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Alright, thanks Squarespace.
And thanks, Hammy.
Sean, tell us the last thing we want to talk about in this video. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about in this video are joints that we most often use in things like table bases or chair and other leg assemblies. These can be miter joints or butt joints or three pieces coming together at one point joints, stuff like that. There are a few considerations when talking about these situations which will help guide us through which joinery method makes the most sense. For the most part, the main focus of these joints, at least in a lot of the furniture we make, is to create a joint that almost makes two pieces of wood look like one. This table is a good example, especially with the black tinted finish that was applied. This joint here makes the whole leg assembly appear as one piece, but only when looking close do we see that it's two pieces of wood. Obviously, when looking at natural wood, the grain gives it away a bit more clearly, but details like smooth joint transitions help with the fluid look. So what's the best way of getting to this result? Well, once again, we have to consider the options and what's important to us. For me, speed and accuracy are once again incredibly important, so fairly obviously, the Domino is my usual go-to for stuff like this. But unlike with long miter joints for boxes or casework, I think these particular instances are where the alternatives lessen the gap and are actually much more comparable. And the method in particular that compares pretty well is dowel joinery. To illustrate this, I'm going to make two identical joints, one with dowels and one with the Domino, and see how they stack up. Honestly, as I'm recording this, I don't know how it's going to go, and I don't know which one's going to be quicker. So, future Sean, how did it go? Well, there you go. I can't believe the
Domino
won. Incredible. But I think the real thing to note here is how close it was, which is why for pieces that utilize a lot of this type of joinery, I always tell people that dowels are a very close alternative. We even put dowel joinery into all of our plans to show how similar it really is. So is the Domino the best tool for this context? Maybe. Is it the only tool for this context? Definitely not. And is it worth it in this context? Again, maybe. It really just depends what's more important to you, your hard-earned cash or the potential time savings. And you know what they say.
Time is money?
That's right.
Okay, so is the Domino worth it?
That's a good question. And I think from my perspective, as a business tool, it's definitely worth it. It's a tool that increases speed and accuracy.
Right.
And in a business setting, that's everything.
Yeah, I guess so. From the perspective of especially our business backgrounds, it's kind of a no-brainer for somebody that's in that like middle tier, not mass producing stuff, but still wants to get things out fairly quickly. So where it gets a little bit more gray maybe is with the hobbyist.
Yeah, and from a hobbyist perspective, which is maybe a little more interesting, should you buy this? And the way that I looked at it was, I think how we view furniture and design, we look at it in kind of a finished overall shape.
Yeah.
And so to me, getting to that point is the exciting part. Whereas there are a lot of people who maybe more of the process.
Love the joinery.
Yeah, and they want to spend time cutting dovetails and things, which is great. So for them, the Domino doesn't make sense.
Yeah, in a weird way, it almost like takes away from your enjoyment,
Right.
because rather than spending an afternoon out in the shop or the garage
Right.
cutting dovetails and relaxing or whatever that is for that person,
Right.
they're speeding
They're
through the
speeding,
process.
right.
So what's the point?
The time.
It's like
for
watching
them-
a movie at triple speed or
Right.
something. Why would you do
Right.
that if you're trying to enjoy the movie?
Right. You want it to go slower, essentially.
Right. That's why I watch all my movies on quarter speed.
And so if I was a hobbyist, I think I probably still would own one.
I think I would too. So maybe, I guess you could boil that down to its simplest is, do you get your enjoyment more from the result or more from the process?
Right.
And wherever you fall within that spectrum, result you're going to skew towards get a Domino, process, maybe you're going to skew away from it a little bit.
Right.
But anyway, we've probably rambled enough, so
We have.
we'll leave it there. Hopefully that gives you something to think about and helps you to make that decision on your own. And we'll see you in the next one.
What are you looking at?
Those people. And those people.